Alright, for this next step we're going to be looking at string height adjustment. And there's a lot of things that come into play for string height adjustment. There's user preference and sort of standards that are recommended by different guitar companies. For me, I've tried various ways of doing this, and this works pretty well for my liking, so I'll go through this with you very quickly. What you'll need is a couple of little things. You'll need a feeler gauge. This is a feeler gauge that you can get at any automotive shop, and it has different gauges here of different thicknesses. Okay, and what I like to use is the 0.24 gauge, and that's sort of the size that I like to work with, and I'll explain how this works. You'll need a little Allen key for your bridge. You can obviously need a pick, and what I think works very well is a capo. Now, what I normally do is I take the guitar and I start off by playing the guitar, and what I do is I just walk through the different strings. I'll try and get this on camera. And I do this all the way down the neck to see if I hear any kind of buzzing. If I do hear buzzing, I'll pay attention to where I hear the buzzing, which string. I'll take note of that, because that will ultimately mean I need to adjust the bridge for that particular string. Now, once I do all of that, and I've already done this for this guitar and it's pretty good, I don't hear very much buzzing at all, I'll take the capo and I'll put it across the first fret. And then what I'll do is I'll take the guitar and I'll press down towards the end of the fretboard. Some people like to do this at the 14th fret. I like to do it a little bit further down. And then I take the gauge, and along, basically at a halfway point, I slip it under the fret. And what I want to do there is I don't want to touch the string, and I'll zoom in so that you can get a better understanding here. Okay, so once the string is pressed down, I take the feeler gauge at about the halfway point and I slip it under the string. And typically you don't want to see the string to move. You don't want to see the string moving, and you don't necessarily want there to be a gap either. This string is pretty much at the point that I would like to see it. And I do that for all the other strings as well. It's a little bit harder to do with the other strings, but you get the idea. So for example, this one is pretty good. The next one too, pretty good. And I go through the entire process with all the strings. At a certain point, it gets easier to go the other way around. And if you see that the strings are being pushed by the feeler gauge, it means that your string is basically going to be too low at that point, and it'll probably cause buzzing, because what you need is a string to be able to freely vibrate without getting any kind of buzzing. So that's why you need a little bit of a curve in the neck at this point, because towards the center point of the string, when the vibrations happen, that's where the string needs the most space. And if your strings are too low, it's going to hit your frets and it's going to cause buzzing. So at that point, if you need to adjust anything, if you find that a string is too high or too low and giving you some buzzing issues, we're going to have to look at the bridge. So let me move over the guitar here so we can focus on the bridge. And I'll zoom in on that a little bit. Alright, So for the bridge, you have the little Allen key, which will basically fit into the little screws that you have at either end of the string. And by loosening the Allen key and the nut, you're lowering that string. By tightening it, you're raising it up. And you don't want to force anything. Sometimes, you know, they jam up a little bit. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slightly bring down the strings, each one of them, and listen for any kind of buzzing. And if I do hear any kind of buzzing, I'm going to just bring them up a touch. That way, if you do that, you're guaranteed the lowest action, because you're bringing it down to the point of vibration and, you know, interference with the fret, and then you just bring it up a little bit. And that's going to be about as low as you can go with the strings. One thing you have to keep in mind, though, when you're adjusting the height of the bridge saddles, is that your strings are going to go out of tune again. So before you start checking for any kind of buzzing, you have to retune the strings again. So the adjustment that I just made, the slight adjustment, basically threw everything out of whack in terms of tuning. So if I try and play the guitar at that point, I'll probably hear buzzing because the strings are not in tune. And they're a little bit slack. So you gotta, every time you make an adjustment, you gotta retune. And then play the strings and see and check for any kind of buzzing. It takes a little bit more time, obviously. It's a time-consuming process, but that's how you're gonna get your guitar to be set up the way you need it to be. There's no shortcuts, really. Not at this point, anyway. In the next step, we're going to be looking at intonation of the bridge. So to be able to intonate the bridge, you got to first of all make sure that your strings are as in tune as possible. And then we're going to look at adjusting the saddle position. And when you're checking your strings, you want to make sure that none of the strings are buzzing out and they all sustain properly. And also when you bend the strings, you want the strings to be able to buzz. I mean bend with no buzz. Sometimes what happens is you're going to bend the strings, and at a certain point they just fret out and they no longer vibrate. That means they're touching one of the other frets. You don't want that. Okay? So we're ready for the intonation process. So let's look at that.